Uh, Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm sure you're gonna be telling us a lot of how much you were impressed by the speech and how much you liked every word President Biden said, and that you agree with every word and sentence.
I agree with his choice of poetry.
Oh yeah, tell us more.
The Second Coming by Yeats. It's a fantastic poem.
Uh-huh.
I don't know why he chose it.
Why do you think?
Well, he refuted the poem, but the poem is a pretty good description of the moment. And there are two lines that he didn't quote. One is that he describes this terrible situation, and then he says, "What rough beast is slouching toward Bethlehem?" So I think when we look at what's going on in the Middle East, we have to ask what rough beast is slouching toward Bethlehem, and of course it's Iran.
Yeah, but
which didn't get enough attention.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to get from you really like big picture take on what we just saw, and how and whether you saw in the speech any attempt by Biden to lay out some sort of a legacy.
Yeah, no, certainly I did. I mean, you're right with your initial comment. I'm going to be a Debbie Downer here. It's a shame to start with a downer right at the beginning, but no, I mean it's very poignant. As he mentioned, he had to step down. I don't think he made that decision comfortably. So
it's not so he didn't step down, as he said, in order to send a message to the world about the importance of democracy.
No, so it's very, very poignant, dear. It's very poignant. I mean, on a personal level, it's almost tragic. And then there are the ideas that he expressed, and I'm sure that he's sincere in the ideas. He wanted to go down in history as a peacemaker, and he has ideas about how to bring peace to the world. But I think those ideas are failing, and you felt it as he went through the different issues, especially on the Middle East, but also on Ukraine. I don't think most people looking at Ukraine think that Russia is losing or that Russia has been stopped and that Ukraine is necessarily going to be victorious. They stopped the Russian armies at a certain point, but Russia is within reach of turning Ukraine into a failed state, of turning it into Mongolia, a landlocked country completely dependent on the West for survival, which is what Putin wants.
But so let's take a step back on this one and say, like, if I told you 4 years ago that Russia is going to invade Ukraine, and the U.S. response to such an invasion, the U.S. and the international response, and now we know what happened. Do you think that, in retrospect, Biden, as he tried to lay out here, managed to unite NATO and the West and strengthen NATO, and that basically Putin failed in his attempt to overrun Ukraine and maybe other countries?
No, I think NATO has been strengthened. There's no doubt about that. In the sense that we have new members, there's a renewed sense of purpose and a renewed focus, and all of that is positive. But we have in the globe Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and then some of their other countries like Venezuela and so on. But the core three, China, Russia, Iran, they're on the rise, and we feel that especially in your part of the world. So President Biden wants Afghanistan to be the sign. He said, "I wanted to bring these wars to an end." So he certainly brought Americans home, and he scaled back American military deployment in certain parts of the world. But there isn't a sense that has brought about a more peaceful world at all. So that's a message that may resonate to some in domestic American politics. But if you're sitting in Tokyo or you're sitting in Seoul or in Jerusalem, none of America's allies that are on the front line against Russia, China, Iran, if you're sitting in Kyiv, feel like they're in a safer world now as a result.
Yeah, let's talk about China for a second. I have to say that I was a bit surprised that, I mean, he touched on China, but it was relatively short. I thought there's going to be much more China, in the speech. I'll ask John Feiner later why was it so short. But so, what did you think about the China part of the speech?
Well, I agree with you. He didn't really touch on it because there's still hope that they can constructively engage China, and they don't want to antagonize it, and they are really feeling it right now in Europe and in the Middle East. And so he prefers to just kind of paper over all of it.
So you think this was intentional to say, we're in the middle of something, I don't want to do something to jeopardize what I'm trying to do until January 20th, so I'll just, say some generic...
The less said, the better. The less said, the better.
Yeah. And how do you think people in, if you're Xi and you're watching this, what's Xi's take?
I'm sure that he understands it very, very well. He understands. Xi has a problem in that his economy is doing very badly. So it isn't simply a question. It's a more nuanced picture than what I suggested a minute ago. It's not simply Russia, China, Iran, new axis on the rise, new Cold War. It's much more complex than that. But Xi is very much aware of the leverage that he has over the West and over Biden, even while he has certain vulnerabilities.
Let's move to another part of the speech, which is obviously
I want to bring you to your part of the world.
No, that's I'm getting there, and you're right that I was also like the China part. Also, the Iran part was pretty short, like sentence or something, or like sentence and a half.
Because they have a thesis that has been totally refuted by events. And their thesis is that you can stabilize the Middle East by engaging Iran directly in negotiation, and by treating each proxy of Iran, each proxy arena, as a separate and disconnected arena in which we can work on the specific grievances in that arena. So in Gaza, we try to come up with a deal between Hamas and Israel. In Lebanon, we try to come up with a deal between Hezbollah and Israel. And he says it's not in anyone's interest that we have this conflict. But Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, told us last week, Israel, no matter what you do, no matter how strong you are, no matter how many blows you successfully land against us, we are not going to let you stabilize the north of your country. That's his interest. And that's because he is working for Iran. So the problem in the region, the thing that connects all of the fronts, is Iran. But that refutes their whole thesis, which is that we can stabilize the region by working with Iran.
And we're almost a year in to the crisis in the Middle East, and it seems that again, if I told you a year ago there's going to be a 1-year war in the Middle East, going to start with Gaza, then Lebanon, Iran, the Houthis, militias in Iraq. Did I miss something? I don't know. But you would tell me I'm crazy?
I wouldn't have believed it. In 1956, Israel conquered Gaza and the entire Sinai in less than 8 days. And so we're well past 8 months, and we still don't have a total control of Gaza. It's amazing.
And
that was a much smaller and weaker Israel too.
And do you think that, again, if we try to take look at the big picture here, do you think that, because for example, President Trump says, if October 7th would never happen if I'm president. Okay, that's his main policy point on the last year of the war in Gaza. But do you think that, again, Biden could have stopped this from happening?
I think they have the wrong. I think they have the wrong. Look, October 7th caught everyone by surprise. It caught me by surprise. I assume it caught you by surprise. The Israelis, the American national security establishment, nobody saw it coming. I wouldn't. If Donald Trump had been in power, he may have seen it as well. Definitely possible. But Biden has defined the problem from day one as a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And he has the solution to the conflict is, as he went, two-state solution, two peoples living side by side in peace, blah, 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 blah. It's not a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It is an Iran-Israel conflict. And that's an objective fact because the Houthis are involved. Hezbollah opened up on, as he mentioned, unprovoked on October 8th. So it's Iran versus Israel. I actually think it's Iran versus the United States. If you frame it that way, then that leads to totally different understanding of what the solutions are. The solution is to deter Iran, not to come up with a deal where we can get Sinwar to agree with Netanyahu.
So if, let's say, that in 2 months Donald Trump is the president-elect, and you get a call from his people and tell you, Mike, listen, come in. Trump wants to consult with you on national security, which is something that we all know Trump is doing all the time because he's very interested in this issue. But he calls you in and tells you, what do you think I should do? Then what would be your advice?
I would say
what's the first thing to do on January 20th on this issue?
The first thing to do is number one, hold Iran responsible for what it does and for what its proxies do. So Iran is responsible for what the Houthis do, and that there will be direct, immediate, and significant penalties to Iran for both its behavior and its proxies. Number two, Palestinians do not get a veto over Israeli security relations with anyone else in the region. And number three, there have to be enough U.S. troops in the Middle East permanently to make your military threat against Iran credible. I'm not saying that Americans need to go to war at all, but the Americans are there to backstop, say, the Israelis. If the Israelis want to carry out a reprisal against the Iranians, then they have escalation dominance because the Americans are behind them.
But isn't the third point is when he kicks you out of the room and tells you, I'm not sending more troops to the Middle East?
No, he says, Mike, thank you very much. He says, thank you very much. Can I plus up the troops in the Middle East in such a way that it will not cause me any pain in domestic politics? And I would say, yes, let's talk to your military advisors about that, and we can come up with a formula so that it will not even be noticed. It needs to be noticed in Tehran. And look at what President Biden told us, that this direct negotiation with Iran and trying to reach a deal with them is going to lead to many fewer American troops in the Middle East. But what happened? What happened is that we had a massive escalation in the Middle East because of Iran, and we had to pull all of these troops out of East Asia and bring them to the Middle East. It's much better if you have a smaller but more lethal force in the Middle East that can pose a constant, credible threat to Iran.
I want to ask you about another thing, because Biden mentioned in the speech again that Israel and Hamas need to take the deal that's on the table and end the war, release the hostages, all of that. Trump barely spoke about this issue, like the hostages, or he just said that need to get the Gaza war over with fast. That was like maybe the only thing he said. If again he calls you in and asks you, Mike, what should I do with this Gaza thing? What would you tell him?
All roads lead to Tehran. You start with the Iranians and Hezbollah, and then you cut the deal you work on the deal with the Palestinians.
So and on the hostage issue,
same thing. I mean, this is the deal with the Palestinians. So as long as Sinwar thinks that Iran is going to pull Israel into a regional war, he's not going to cut a deal.
Yeah. Let's talk about the final message in the speech, which at least I found strange that it was at the end of the speech and not at the beginning, because it felt to me like this is what Biden wanted his main message of the speech to be, which is the part about democracy and how leaders should work for the people, not for themselves, and while bringing his own example of stepping down. Do you think that when other members of other countries were sitting in the room listening to Biden and knowing that Donald Trump could be here next year, what did they think about what might Donald Trump say about democracy in the world?
So this is the UN. I mean, what percentage of these guys are from democracies? They sat there and they heard that and they said, "Oh, the Americans are talking about democracy again." And they look at their watch. There's not. I don't think any of that rhetoric. I don't think any of that rhetoric resonated with those people in that room.
So you think that next year, if
the LGBTQ rights in Africa, did that resonate with the leaders of the African countries?
No. So I'm asking if next year it's Donald Trump, and he doesn't deal with all this democracy stuff, but just say his own thing. You think it will resonate more with countries around the world?
I think there's a certain level of American rhetorical flourish that everyone is used to hearing, and every one of them is going to look at America and look at what its policies are toward their particular part of the world and ask whether this is benefiting me or not.
Mike Durant, thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us here, and thank you for giving your take on Biden's speech. Thank you very much. So again, thank you, Mike, and we'll move to our next speaker, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor, John Feiner. How's it going?
It's all right.
Yeah? I'm good. Pretty slow news week, so, we have time to talk about issues like, the state of democracy around the world. I don't know if you heard, I just said that I was surprised that this part of the speech came at the end and not at the beginning.
Well, I think you should only be surprised about that if you've not been listening to President Biden's kind of themes that have run through his presidency from the very beginning. And I think it tied in very well to what he mentioned at the very beginning of the speech, because for those of you who listened, the president talked about the fact that we are in a complicated moment globally, and that we don't shy away from that, but that he came to office now almost 50 years ago, a little more than 50 years ago, for the first time, at another complicated global moment. And he came in with a degree of optimism that American leadership could bring the world to a better place. He believes we ultimately did lead through that difficult period, have led through other difficult periods, and will, in the current moment, lead through a very difficult period, in part because of the decisions he made at the beginning of his presidency to invest in our core sources of strength in the United States and resurrect in some cases, our alliances, and not a minute too soon to deal with the challenges that we face now. And the final message, which you just referenced, was really a message to the other leaders in the hall. It is, after all, a room full of world leaders, that you should love your job, that you should love serving your people, but that you should recognize that you are ultimately a servant of the people in your country, and that you can't love having the job more than you love the good of the country and the future of the country, which is how he explained the decision he made not to run this time.
Yeah, but it felt to me also a bit like, I don't know, a bit like self-serving maybe, that it's not like the first moment he saw the situation, he said, okay, I'm stepping down. It took some time and persuasion, which again, it's natural, but it just felt to me a bit like that he put himself on a pedestal and said, oh, you see, look what I did, you should learn from me,
Look, I don't think we need to spend too much time relitigating a decision the president made. He took his time to make it. He made it on his own timeline, and on his own terms, which I think he was very much entitled to, having been elected President of the United States. And I would encourage you to compare his process and his decision to how other leaders have handled similar situations when there's a time to transition power. And I think history will look very kindly and favorably on what President Biden did.
Let's talk about the different crises he talked about during the speech. And I think most of them are crises that started when he was president. And when, after the last election, when you were, preparing for, what you want to do in this term, how many of those crises did you say, oh, those things are most likely to happen when we're in the White House?
Well, I mean, leaving aside predictions, which I think at this point and at this moment in world affairs are kind of a fool's errand. We wouldn't have made a bunch of predictions at the beginning of administration, and I'm sure they all would have been wrong, as they would be with any administration. But I'm not totally convinced by what you said about all of these crises emerging during the Biden years. After all, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has been going on since 2013, 2014. There's definitely a new element that has occurred over the last few years, and the United States has rallied the world to help Ukraine defend itself, to maintain its sovereignty, and frankly to frustrate and prevent Russia from achieving any of its core objectives in this conflict. And that will be on full display this week when President Zelensky speaks to the United Nations as the leader of a free and sovereign nation, and then comes to Washington to talk to the president about the way forward and how the United States can further support Ukraine in its conflict. You know better than anybody in this room that the conflict in the Middle East did not begin on October 7th, even though this phase of the conflict certainly did. And here too, every administration that I'm aware of in modern history has had to deal with crises in the Middle East. This is a uniquely turbulent region, has been for decades, and we are working day in, day out with our Israeli partners to try to manage this conflict, bring the war in Gaza to an end in a way that brings the hostages home, first and foremost, establishes a ceasefire, eases what has been an enormous humanitarian burden on the people living in Gaza, and ultimately de-escalates the situation in the north, which we are also extremely concerned about.
Yeah, but again, I'm going again through the hotspots that he talked about in the speech: Afghanistan, Gaza, Lebanon, Ukraine, Russia, Sudan. Those are all things that, again, even though there were crises in those areas, a lot of what we see today was influenced by either U.S. decisions, U.S. policy, or lack of.
Again, not surprising probably to you that I don't totally share that view. On Afghanistan, the president ended U.S. involvement in that war. There was a decision that he made that several presidents had looked at before him. He says 3 or 4 presidents had looked at this decision, had wanted to make this decision, had ultimately not been able to follow through on it, and that he was not going to hand this conflict off to a 5th American president. So he made that decision. And I think looking around the world, it is hard to argue. I don't even know how you would begin to argue that the United States would be better off if we had thousands of American troops today deployed in Afghanistan while we are trying to wrestle with these other conflicts and these other crises. And I think that decision was fundamentally, strategically in the interest of the United States. And there have not been serious reverberations, ramifications from it.
But there is an argument that because of not the decision, but the way it was implemented, created the perception of, chaos or of U.S. weakness that gave a lot of, a backwind to a lot of bad actors around the world.
We can debate perception, and I think perception is probably best answered by people other than me on the inside of the U.S. government. But what I can tell you is, in talking to our counterparts around the world, in talking to our allies, I don't think there are any who wish that the United States were further invested, further involved in Afghanistan at the expense of all of the other crises that we are seeking to manage. We don't hear that from anybody. We don't hear that from the Europeans. We don't hear that from our allies in Asia. We don't hear that from our allies in the Middle East. And I think there's a very good reason for that, which is strategically, the president had the vision to see that that conflict was no longer in the American interest to continue fighting.
I was surprised that China part in the speech was relatively short, especially when you compare it to the pretty big amount of time you spent on this issue. I mean, the White House spent on this issue in the last few months with the re-engagement with China and, Jake Sullivan's trip. And why was it was both short and sort of general? Why was this?
Well, I mean, I guess I would encourage you also to see China as a through line that runs through our entire theory of foreign policy and many of the topics the president discussed, even if it wasn't directly referenced. When the president talks about preparing the country, strengthening the country, building a stronger foundation under our foreign policy, first and foremost by these foundational investments that we've made through legislation in our infrastructure, in restoring our manufacturing base, in protecting and securing technologies that are core to national security. There's a China subtext to all of that, whether or not the word China comes up in every single one of those sections. And I think everybody paying attention to the president's speech knows that. In terms of how the president sees the U.S.-China relationship, I think he's been very clear. He says it's a fundamentally competitive relationship between two countries, but that competition has to be managed responsibly. That is going to require a degree of diplomatic engagement. I think we in the Biden administration give some credit to our predecessors in the Trump administration for diagnosing competition with China as the fundamental nature of the relationship. We have just gone about that competition in a fundamentally different and we believe more successful way. And I think the narrative around the United States and China that you hear now, given the current state of the Chinese economy and the current state of the American economy, given the degree to which we have rebuilt and restored our alliances, including in the Indo-Pacific, but far beyond the Indo-Pacific, has changed fundamentally since we took office, when the prevailing wisdom was China was on this inexorable rise, the United States was either plateauing or in decline. People are not saying that anymore.
And are you surprised, maybe surprised not the right word, but did you, if you're going back to 2020, after the elections, did you expect then that, because I heard from a lot of people at the time that they expected that during the Biden's time in office, there will be some sort of military confrontation in China, which, again, there's still a few months, but it didn't happen. Meaning that, so were you surprised that, or did you really think that's going to be the case, and you were surprised that it didn't happen?
I mean, again, going back to what we expected or what we predicted in 2020, I'm not sure how useful that is. Frankly, I'm not sure how well I remember what I would have expected or predicted in 2020. You're right that there has not been a direct military confrontation between the United States and China. And I think fundamentally, and I think most leaders in the world and most people in the world would agree, that's a good thing. Good thing for the United States, good thing for China, good thing for the world. But that has not, the desire to avoid that, and we do want to avoid that, has not in any way led our administration or our policy to take the foot off the gas in terms of extremely competitive approach to the U.S.-China relationship, to rebuilding our alliances, which China fundamentally does not like, and we have continued down that path in spite of the fact that some of that creates tension and friction in the relationship.
Let's move to talk about the Middle East part of the speech. Did you think, or did the president think, on October 7th of last year, that a year later we'll be where we are right now?
You seem very keen to get me to reveal my predictions from the past and whether they've borne out. So since I'm not on the record having predicted one way or the other, I'm probably not going to predict going forward from here or reveal what I thought then. But look, this conflict has gone on longer than we want it to. That is quite clear. We have said that this conflict should end, but not just on any terms. There are many, many innocent people who are still captive inside Gaza. And we are not calling for an end to the conflict that ignores their plight. We think that would be fundamentally inhumane and irresponsible. And so there needs to be an agreement that releases those people, that frees up a massive surge in humanitarian assistance in Gaza, which is desperately needed and which brings an end to the war.
But he stood there and he said, I put a proposal on the table, both sides should take it. And it's sort of like, he says it, but it seems that your influence about this issue is almost non-existent, that it's like, I don't know, sending a message to space, hoping somebody will will take it. Seems that both parties are totally not interested.
So ultimately, we're not a combatant in this conflict. We are supporting very strongly Israel in its desire very legitimate desire to make sure that Hamas is no longer able to threaten them from Gaza in the way they did on October 7th, and frankly should not be part of the future of governance in Gaza either. We've been very clear about that. But ultimately, it is up to the two parties who are fighting to decide when this conflict comes to an end. We can incentivize that. We can put pressure on that. We can work with our partners and allies, as we are with the Qataris and the Egyptians and others in the region and outside the region, to try to push for an end of the conflict. But wars end when the combatants themselves decide that they should end. We believe it should end now on the terms that we've put forward, and we'll see what they decide.
Yeah, but the problem is that one of your goals was not only that the hostages will be freed, that the war in Gaza would end. Your goal was that it's not going to spill over, not going to widen to other parts in the region, and it did.
Well, I mean, again, I kind of hate this expression, but there's a trope about the Middle East that it always gets worse before it gets worse, or something along those lines. And the reality is there have been elements of spillover into other theaters, and there have been other actors who have gotten involved, but not to the degree that I think everyone feared might be the case when this conflict first erupted. And I think that is very largely due to a few steps that the United States has taken, and I can explain them. Your previous speaker, Mike Duran, talked about the need for force posture in the region. The United States has significantly increased our force posture since the conflict began on October 7th. We have moved aircraft carriers and the ships associated with them to the region. We have plussed up our air capacity in terms of fighter planes in different U.S. bases in the region. And we have demonstrated that we are willing to use those capabilities to defend Israel when it is threatened, as we did on April 13th, to an unprecedented degree. No administration, no U.S. administration has ever defended Israel as directly as the United States did on that day, and thwarted what was the largest ever international attack from Iran on Israel in history. Made that attack a failure. We've said we would be willing to do that again if Iran threatened Israel. And we do. We stand ready to do that again. So the United States has played a significant role in trying to prevent the conflict from escalating to the region. We are, as I said, extremely concerned about that possibility right now across the northern border.
What do you mean that possibility? It's happening.
Again,
there's a war in Lebanon.
There is a conflict in Lebanon there is fighting back and forth in Lebanon that began right after October 7th when Hezbollah attacked Israel. That could be a much bigger war. So and that what we are concerned about is a much bigger war.
So you don't define what is going right now?
Again, definitely, you're trying to play a semantic game, but I think the important thing, Barack, is that this could get worse. We do not want it to spread. We do not want it to escalate, and we are working to try to tamp it down. And the reality is, Hezbollah attacked Israel right after October 7th. October 7th was not fundamentally about Hezbollah. They chose to insert themselves into the October 7th conflict, and we have been seeking to prevent that from escalating ever since. And the reality is, again, I don't need to explain this to you, tens of thousands of Israelis have had to leave their homes in the north because of this conflict. It is extremely understandable and rational for Israel to want those people to be able to return, and that is what they say. That is the stated objective of their military actions in Lebanon. What we believe, though, is that a wider war, a bigger war, is fundamentally not in the interest of Israel, not likely to make it easier for those people to return home soon, and frankly, not easier for the people of Lebanon either, who are suffering tremendously in the current.
But what the Israelis also say is that the reason that we're seeing what we're seeing over the last week is because the U.S. effort to find diplomatic solution didn't materialize.
On Lebanon?
Yes.
No, I think what the Israelis are saying is they are seeking to create the conditions for people to be able to return home. That's what we hear from our Israeli partners. That's what they say publicly.
So what's the plan?
What's the plan?
Yes, what's the plan? Because you say that you want a diplomatic solution. You say that that's the best way to solve this. But it doesn't seem, it seems that in Gaza you're stuck because nothing moves on the hostage deal. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah refuses to disconnect itself from Hamas in Gaza. So how do you create a diplomatic solution in such conditions? So
look, the way these things tend to work is there's no solution until there is. The president actually said at the end of his speech, he used a line from Nelson Mandela, it always looks impossible until it is done. George Mitchell had a line about making peace in Northern Ireland, that there were 700 bad days and one good one when this ultimately ended. We do see a path.
He never had the good one with Israel-Palestine.
We do see a path forward in Gaza to ultimately end the war, and we have laid out what that path looks like. We see a similar path to de-escalating the situation in the north between Israel and Hezbollah. We're working on that in real time right here in New York and in capitals around the world. We're not going to reveal all the details of those sensitive conversations, but we very much want that conflict to de-escalate and are working on that this week.
John Feiner, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Sarah Cahill-Gu, Executive Editor of Axios Live, and thank you so much for being here. Unfortunately, Ambassador Wood is unable to join us today, so this concludes our program. Just join me in thanking Barack for his great interviews on the stage and our great speakers, Mike Duran and John Feiner, this morning to get very different perspectives about foreign policy, national security around the world. Thank you for coming.